Thank you, Cathaoirleach, and thank you for your presentation. I think notwithstanding the fact that you only joined Bank of Ireland in recent months, I think I think you have a key role to play in answering the why, and why 10,000 or over 10,000 customers, why the money was removed from their accounts. And I think that's the key thing that we have to get right. And I think what people will find astounding is that you actually got, from what I'm hearing, you got legal advice on the contractual obligations of Bank of Ireland. And the legal advice instructed you to do something illegal, which was to remove the money from these people's accounts. Can you just explain that to me? And explain, I mean, did you get external legal advice? Is that legal advice from within the bank? Do you still have the same legal advisors? I mean, that cost you, cost Bank of Ireland, what, €200 million?
Okay. Thank you for the question. So, when I talked earlier about the context of this, that the tracker mortgage was removed in 2008 because it was not a sustainable or profitable product. Many customers were able to continue to roll from a fixed to a tracker rate, as was their contractual right. So 20,000 customers during this period, that process worked well. But there were customers where either there was a marginal error, an operational mistake, relatively small, 0.15%, which has been addressed and fixed, that occurred. Plus, there were 6,000 customers rather where they didn't get that contractual right. There was no, and again, I'm new in role, but from all the work that I've seen, there was no intent to charge incorrectly. No money was taken from a customer's account.
I cannot figure out how your legal people did not pick this up. If somebody's looking at a contract and customers are contacting you at the time as which they did, that the legal team aren't saying, okay, this is, we seek legal opinion here all the time on different things. Why is it that none of your legal advisors said there's an illegality here? You are going to do something illegal if you continue on to take this money from people or not to give people their contractual rights. I just, as an ordinary layperson, I cannot understand that.
Thank you for your question. So we have worked with our colleagues, both in legal and our people, our colleagues that deal with customers every day to set this right. My energy and focus has been on redressing this quickly. Since we included the 6,000 November, we have worked very hard to try and put this right for customers. In terms of understanding a root cause, in terms of how were there legal errors or operational errors in the implementation of our mortgages, that is a deep dive investigation that is ongoing. I've talked about what I understand to have been the context for the reason why tracker mortgages were discontinued, the fact that many customers would have continued to have a contractual right to their tracker, but cases where we got it wrong, and for that reason we've apologised and we are making it right. For me to understand the root cause, I really want that investigation and review, apologies for interrupting, to complete, and that is what is happening now.
Okay, have you the same legal teams in place, and do you use the same external legal advisors as you used back during that period? Between 2009 and 2010?
I'm not aware of who are the legal advisors over 10 years ago. We use a variety. We are always looking and working with our internal or external advisors to ensure that the products and services that we offer our customers are clear and fair. I don't want to preempt the findings of the review that is ongoing, but looking at it from my perspective, the fresh pair of eyes, as the board asked me to do, I think two of the things that I've deduced is, one, we could be more, go further in our customer focus when having dealt with this issue. But secondly, our terms and conditions and the transparency of contracts could be clearer in terms of some of the wording and the documentation we use. There's an opportunity for us to be clearer and simpler in our approach with customers.
Okay, I'm not going to get anywhere. Like, legal advice is fairly clear cut. Something is either legal or it's illegal. And, you know, to end up costing the bank or costing citizens, because at the end of the day, you're going to be able to write this off against tax over the 20-year period, and that you won't have profits there, so the citizen is going to end up paying for it, I think is just totally acceptable. I hope none of these legal people that were involved then would be involved in the independent review panel. I mean, how could people know that?
What I would say, Senator, is that the legal advice, as you would expect, is to honour contracts where a clear legal right exists. So where there was a clear legal right, and we talked about 20,000 customers who moved from fixed to tracker from 2008 onwards, where that was absolutely complied, legally appropriate and right. We had identified 590 customers where we had got it wrong, and that was identified back in December 2016. We've had the discussion around the 6,000. In some cases there were errors, in some there was lack of clarity, and in some, when we put our feet in the shoes of the customer, it was not reasonable, hence our inclusion within this additional group of redress. I've not seen from my review and from understanding this and working with colleagues that there was any legal intent not to do the right thing. The opposite, we are trying to do the right thing here. My energy and focus of myself, the board and the team is on making this right.
We get that. When do you expect your review to be concluded?
I beg your pardon, Senator.
When do you expect your review to be concluded?
It's ongoing. I would expect it to be concluded during the first quarter of this year.
And if you find that individuals have been responsible for this, are you going to hold them individually to account?
I don't want to prejudge or preempt the findings. When I talked before about the culture that we want and the purpose at Bank of Ireland, I talked about the 4 key values, and one of those values is accountability. And accountability needs to be owned by the senior management of this organisation. I find that many of our colleagues in the front line are role models for accountability and doing the right thing for our customers. We need to ensure that they have the products, the policies, the processes that enable them to do a fantastic job for Bank of Ireland's customers. We will look at, I want to see the conclusion of the report, and then I will ensure that we hold ourselves accountable for learning from this experience and from the tracker issue. Yes.
Have you received a letter from the Central Bank that reminds board members and senior executives of their responsibilities around reporting any criminality that they may come across in reviewing?
As you'd imagine, Senator, normally the correspondence between the bank and the central bank isn't disclosed, but I know the central bank sat here and were very explicit. I have received the letter, as I anticipate other CEOs of banks have, reminding us of our statutory obligations, correct?
Now, I just want to ask you, at the time when you had 600 cases, you had identified 4 people who had lost their homes because of the tracker mortgage scandal at that time. Now that you have 9,400, how many homes would you estimate have been lost through the tracker mortgage device?
So when we originally completed the information in our questionnaire for this committee at the end of, which reflected 31st December numbers as of, we had identified 4 customers who had lost a property as a direct consequence of being denied a tracker rate. As we have progressed and looked at more cases, that number has now increased to 14 customers where there has been a loss of home.
That's 14 families you're talking about, is that right?
8 of those would have been owner-occupied, and 6 of those would have been buy-to-let.
Right. That is absolutely disgraceful. And then I look at the figures here of the average compensation, where you have 14, as it is now, people who have lost their homes. The absolute trauma and distress and everything else of somebody losing their home. If I may respond to... Do you have the houses now? Do you have those 14 houses in your possession?
We will have one of those houses, which we will make available to the customer if they would want the house. I do not underestimate the impact this has had on people's loss of home, whether it was their primary residence or whether it was a buy-to-let. The average compensation that you're looking at won't necessarily include those more complex cases, which we are working on now, and the average will be reduced by the 0.15% margin issue, where the average redress was relatively small. So I think that the average doesn't represent the focus that we're putting into working out those more complex cases where there has been loss of ownership. In one of those cases, the compensation would have been 250,000 euros as a minimum for a loss of ownership. Compensation will be starting at 50,000 euros, and we look at those case by case to make sure that we're doing the right thing. I do not underestimate the impact of loss of ownership from the tracker issue.
Where are the other 13 houses if you have one in your possession?
I'm going to ask John to respond in terms of what would have happened to those properties. We have information.
Senator, thank you. In terms of the other homes, of the 8 homes, we still have one in possession. One is a mortgage to rent case, where the family still resides in the property, but it's in the mortgage to rent scheme, and 6 were sold via consensual sale with the customer. I think, just going back to the compensation question that you asked previously, I think in these cases, I think it's important to bring out that on top of the compensation structure that we set out in the return of the Q&A to the committee, that any customer where it is being deemed there is direct causation for the loss of the home, and whilst we know that money on its own will not be an answer for the suffering of those families, what we have also done within that compensation structure is to ensure that any residual debt that would have been left from the sale of the home is written off in full, that any payments towards that residual debt that were made by the customer after the sale of the property will be returned. There will be a minimum of €50,000 in terms of compensation. Any gain in value of the property since the date that it was sold, given the rising property market we have at the moment, that differential will also be given back to the customer. And similarly, we will also look to calculate a future value that they would have had from the tracker mortgage that was removed from them versus the value of the standard variable rate, and that is an additional payment to the customer on top. And then finally, we will try, if possible, and if the customer wishes to return them to a tracker rate in purchasing a new home, or if in the case of the mortgage to rent scheme, to see if we can, if they wish, to repurchase it from the housing body.
How many of those were voluntary surrenders, did you say?
6. So for the loss of ownership of the 8 owner-occupied cases, none were repossessed. 6 were via consensual sale. 1 resulted in a trade down to a more affordable property, and 1 was the case that John referred to that was mortgage to rent.
So there weren't any court cases through the process. But my God, anywhere along the line of getting, of repossessing somebody's house, did nobody within the bank, be they legal, be the CEO, be the board, did nobody say, have a look, hold on and let's have a look here? Good God.
I understand I understand that those are 14 cases that are the most extreme in terms of the financial impact and the personal anxiety that would have had on the people impacted. Our focus now is on making this right. As I've mentioned, we are doing a review to learn from this. None of those properties were repossessed, but to understand why this wasn't identified before and proactively is something that we do need to understand, absolutely.
Do you expect there to be more than 14? Is 14 the...
We continue to, we've got until the 31st of March so to finish working through all cases. As I mentioned, we've contacted 9 out of 10 customers. I know that the central bank talks about the industry completing by the end of June, I think. Our commitment at Bank of Ireland, because we want to expedite this and do it as quickly and efficiently for our customers and for all our stakeholders, is to complete by the 31st of March. So this is an ongoing work.
You see, when you say as quickly and as efficiently, and this has been going on for years and years, like it really lacks, You know, it lacks credibility. And I understand what you're trying to do now, but some of the language even around being used around here, being customer-centred and all of that, it really is very hard for people to accept. Have you been contacted by any family where anybody has lost their lives as a result of what has been done to them through this?
I'm not aware of any case like that.
I just think it's deserved. I need to ask you, I'm just going to move on from that, but I find it absolutely distressing that this systematic robbery has happened across the board and nobody anywhere. People getting paid multitudes and multitudes and multitudes of, you know, pensions that people are on and all of that. It's just the mind boggles. It's criminal. There's no other word for it. I need to ask you around the buy-to-let mortgages that are in arrears and the 1%, that you admit that as a matter of routine, your bank applied a 1% surcharge to the buy-to-let mortgages in arrears. And maybe just to remind you what a couple of different bodies said about that, the Financial Services Ombudsman told the committee that the policy sounds wrong on the face of it. And indeed the Minister for Finance told my colleague here, Piers Doherty, that the practice to which the Deputy is referring, on which he has had information made available, should not have occurred. It's another example of the appalling way in which this matter developed and has since been handled. And then the central bank said of it, this can only be done if the alternative repayment arrangement is affordable to the borrower and is a long-term sustainable solution, which is consistent with the Central Bank of Ireland policy on sustainability. Yet based on your reply to the questionnaire that you submitted, you seem to stand over the policy. So I suppose the question is it your contention that it was okay because they were not family homes but buy-to-lets? And has the Central Bank been in contact with you on the issue?
I'm going to ask John to respond. He has the detail on that, Senator.
Sorry?
I will ask John to respond on the detail, Senator.
Senator, if I try and address the question, yes, in terms of buy-to-let investment properties, where they are not part of the CCMA Act, the bank does, when approached by a customer looking for a long-term sustainable solution, typically it arises because, let's say, the rent was too low versus the cost of the mortgage, or it was moving from interest only to capital and interest payments. And typically it would be requested that the mortgage be extended out over a longer period of time. And as part of that restructuring, to make sure there is long-term sustainability, the process and the product applied by the bank was to move it onto a buy-to-let plus 1% rate, which is a tracker variable rate plus 1%. What we found with that is that there are a number of customers who have that. We have engaged with different parties on it over the years, and you know, anything that we brought through in that way would have been in keeping with the regulation.
So are you going to end this policy, you know, that has been condemned in the way by the Central Bank and by the Ombudsman and by the Minister for Finance? Are you going to end it?
Going to keep it under consistent review, and we're going to consider that as part of our ongoing work into the tracker examination.
And to tell us here today that you're going to end it, even though you've heard what I've said.
We're going to keep it under ongoing review.
Has it been included in the tracker review?
They were looked at as part of the tracker examination, but they are not included as part of the impacted customers under the examination.
Quite staggering that you're going to continue on regardless. You know, and that's what I talk about, the language, when you're saying that, you know, everything is going to be different from now on, the culture is going to change, we're customer-centred and all of that. And yet you have the Central Bank, who's the regulatory body, saying what I just read out to you. You have the Ombudsman and you have the Minister for Finance, all saying that this is wrong. And you cannot tell me here today that you're going to end it as a bank. And sorry, Mr. McDonagh, but you're the CEO of the bank. Have you discussed it within the bank? Have you thought about ending it?
Okay, my focus since I arrived in the context of trackers has been on understanding which customers to include, and we included the 6,000 in November, and all of the energy has been on redressing them for the benefit of the customers and being in contact. I continue to engage constructively with the central bank and with the Minister and all our stakeholders to ensure that we're offering the right products and the right pricing to our customers.
This is very, very clearly the exploitation of vulnerable customers. There's no other word for it. And I would ask you, as a member of this committee, all of the other committee members, to please end that policy. You know, to take the advice of the Central Bank, of the Ombudsman and of the Minister for Finance and of this committee, I would take it to end that practice.
Senator, if I may, I will look at the case. I understand what you referenced to the Financial Services Ombudsman. In the particular case, they found in favour of the bank, but I will continue to look at any particular cases or concerns that are expressed to me by stakeholders.
Thank you. Thank you, Senator
McDonagh.